It started with an invitation. My best friend, Jake, had found a cabin deep in the woods near Lake Summers. He called it the perfect summer getaway, cheap, isolated, and surrounded by nothing but nature. At first, I hesitated. The thought of spending an entire week disconnected from the world wasn't exactly appealing, but eventually, his enthusiasm won me over. We arrived on a hot July afternoon, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer. The dirt road leading to the cabin was barely a road at all, more like a scar through the dense forest. Trees loomed on either side, their shadows stretching long and dark despite the bright sunlight. When we finally reached the cabin, I felt a chill run through me. Something about the place felt off. The wood was old and rotting in places, the windows murky as if they hadn't been cleaned in years. Still, we shrugged it off and carried our bags inside. That first night, we built a fire outside and sat under the stars, drinking cheap beer and reminiscing about old times. The woods around us were eerily silent, except for the occasional rustling in the underbrush. At one point, Jake joked about the cabin's history, saying he'd read online that people had gone missing in the area. I laughed it off, but something about his tone made my skin prickle. Around midnight, we heard it, the distant sound of footsteps crunching on the dry leaves. At first, we thought it was an animal, maybe a deer. But as the sound grew closer, it became clear that these were human footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Jake grabbed the flashlight and aimed it toward the treeline. Nothing. The noise stopped the moment the light hit the trees. "Probably just your imagination," Jake said, forcing a chuckle. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. The next day, we explored the area around the lake. The water was dark, almost black, despite the bright sun above. Something about it made me uneasy. There were no fish, no ripples, not even a single insect buzzing over the surface. It was too still. Jake, of course, jumped right in, splashing around like a kid. I stayed on the shore watching. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the air grew thick with humidity. We decided to head back to the cabin before it got too dark. As we walked, I had the strangest sensation that we were being watched. Every so often, I would glance over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, or something, lurking in the trees. But there was nothing. That night was worse than the first. I woke up to the sound of whispering. At first, I thought it was Jake talking in his sleep, but when I turned toward him, he was fast asleep, his breathing slow and steady. The whispering grew louder. It was coming from outside. Heart pounding, I crept to the window and peered out. The trees stood motionless, their twisted branches silhouetted against the moonlit sky. But just beyond the tree line, I saw it, a figure standing perfectly still, facing the cabin. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My mind screamed at me to wake Jake, to do something, but my body was frozen in fear. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there watching. I don't know how long I stood there staring back, but eventually, exhaustion won over terror, and I must have fallen asleep. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream. But as I stepped outside, my stomach dropped. There, in the dirt just outside the cabin, were footprints. They led from the trees to the window where I had been standing the night before. And then nothing. No tracks leading away. I wanted to leave. I begged Jake to pack up and go, but he laughed it off, saying I was being paranoid. "It's just some local messing with us," he said. But deep down, I knew better. That night, I didn't sleep. Every creak of the old wood, every whisper of wind sent my heart racing. And then, around 3 a.m., the whispers returned. Louder this time. Closer. I clenched my fists, trying to will myself to stay calm. And then, the front door creaked open. I bolted upright, my breath caught in my throat. Jake was already awake, staring at the door with wide, terrified eyes. The door stood slightly ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. Beyond it, the darkness seemed to press inward, suffocating alive. And then a footstep. Inside the cabin, Jake grabbed the flashlight and aimed it toward the doorway. Empty. But the air was thick with something unseen, something wrong. And then the whispering stopped. Complete silence. Jake and I didn't speak. We didn't move. We sat there, frozen, until the first light of dawn trickled through the windows. As soon as it was bright enough, we packed up and left, neither of us daring to look back at the cabin. But we should have. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I saw the cabin's front porch. And standing there was the figure. Closer now, watching us leave. That night back home, I finally allowed myself to relax. Safe. Far away. But just as I was drifting to sleep, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. It was a photo. A picture of me sleeping in my bed. and in the corner of the room, just barely visible in the shadows, the figure was there. I never should have gone back to Lake Summers, but nostalgia is a dangerous thing. It clouds your judgment, makes you remember things as sweeter than they really were. When my old high school friends suggested a reunion trip to our childhood summer camp, now abandoned, I hesitated. But I let myself be convinced. Big mistake. The camp had been shut down for over a decade, left to rot after the mysterious disappearance of a counselor. The authorities never found a body, just an empty cabin, a bloody handprint on the wall, and a name scratched into the wooden floor. Run. Most of us had long since moved on, but coming back felt like reclaiming a part of our youth. Or at least, that's what I told myself. We arrived late in the afternoon. The cabins were still standing, but barely. Moss-covered roofs, shattered windows, doors hanging from rusted hinges. The lake was as still as I remembered, dark and depthless. Something about the silence unsettled me. No birds, no insects. Just the whisper of the wind through the trees. We set up a bonfire near the old mess hall. Laughter and alcohol dulled the unease creeping up my spine. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, a strange tension settled over us. It was Jake who noticed it first. Anyone else hear that? We fell silent. Faint, distant, like a child's laughter, carried on the wind. Probably just an echo from the lake, Sarah said, though her voice wavered. That night, I lay awake in my sleeping bag inside the main cabin. The others were already asleep, but I kept hearing faint shuffling outside. At first, I thought it was one of us sneaking off to pee in the woods, but then I heard the creak of the front porch steps. I held my breath. A shadow passed by the window. I turned to wake Jake, but he was gone. His sleeping bag lay crumpled, empty. My stomach clenched. Quietly, I got up, careful not to wake the others, and slipped outside. Moonlight filtered through the trees. The lake shimmered, black as ink. And then I saw him, Jake, standing at the water's edge, completely still. Jake! My voice barely carried. He turned slowly, and I saw his face. His eyes were wrong. Too wide, too dark. His mouth twitched, like he was trying to form words but couldn't. And then in a whisper he said, "It's under the lake." Something moved beneath the surface. A ripple expanding outward. I took a step back. "Come closer," Jake whispered, but it wasn't his voice. It was layered, distorted, like multiple voices speaking at once. I ran. Behind me, I heard footsteps pounding against the ground. Too many footsteps. Like a crowd was chasing me. I burst into the cabin, shaking Sarah awake. "We need to leave. Now." The others groggily stirred, grumbling, but I was already grabbing my bag. I turned back to the door and froze. Jake stood there, soaking wet, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. His lips moved, but the voice that came out wasn't his. "Why did you come back?" The lights flickered. Shadows stretched unnaturally, twisting along the walls. And then the laughter returned, high-pitched, echoing from everywhere at once. We ran to the car. The engine sputtered, but by some miracle it roared to life. As we peeled away, I risked one last glance in the rearview mirror. Jake stood at the edge of the lake, watching us go. And then, slowly, he sank beneath the surface, the water swallowing him whole without a single ripple. None of us spoke on the drive home. We just drove, the silence heavier than any words. But later that night, as I lay awake in my apartment, I heard it again, laughter, distant but growing closer. I never should have gone back to Lake Summers. Summertime at my uncle's lake house was supposed to be an escape, a break from the chaos of city life. It had been years since I visited Lake Summers, but I remembered the warmth of childhood summers, the scent of pine and water, the bonfires and ghost stories. This time, I was going alone, hoping for peace and nostalgia. Instead, I found something else. The lake house was exactly as I remembered, rustic, wooden, nestled between thick trees with a private dock stretching into the water. But as I unpacked, an unease settled in. The air was too still, the lake's surface too smooth, like a sheet of glass. No fish jumped, no dragonflies skimmed the surface. Just silence. On my first night, I walked along the dock, letting my fingers trail in the water. The lake was strangely warm, like bath water. I pulled my hand back, unsettled. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement beneath the surface, a pale shape, drifting just below. I froze, but when I looked directly at it, it was gone. That night, I dreamed of drowning. not flailing or fighting, but sinking calmly, as if being pulled by invisible hands. I woke up gasping, my sheets damp with sweat. The second night, I heard footsteps on the dock. Slow, deliberate. I grabbed a flashlight and peered out the window, but saw nothing. Still, the wooden planks creaked, as if someone was standing just outside. I opened the door, shining the light across the dock. Empty. Then drip, drip, drip. Water, pooling at the entrance of the house. Footprints, wet and glistening, leading from the dock inside. I slammed the door shut, my heart pounding. I didn't sleep. By the third day, I was ready to leave. As I packed, I glanced out the window one last time. The lake. Something was floating near the dock. A body. Pale, bloated, motionless. I stumbled back, my stomach twisting. But when I looked again, it was gone. The water was smooth, undisturbed. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys. As I turned the ignition, my phone buzzed. A message. No name, just an image. A photograph. Of me. Standing at the dock. With something behind me. A hand, white and wrinkled, resting on my shoulder. I left Lake Summers that day, and I never went back. But sometimes, in the silence of night, I hear it again, drip, drip, drip. Footsteps on wet wood. And I know the drowned ones have found me again. I tried to move on. I truly did. But something followed me. The first few nights after leaving the lake house, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt wet fingers brush against my skin. The air in my apartment was always damp, and no matter how much I dried the floor, there were always puddles near my bed. Then the whispers started. They weren't words, just the sound of breath bubbling through water, choked gasps distant, yet close enough to make my skin crawl. I covered my mirrors, stopped answering unknown calls, and threw my phone in a drawer after more pictures appeared. Always of me, always taken from inside my own home. One night, as I lay awake, I heard it. Drip, drip, drip. The sound wasn't coming from my bathroom. It was coming from under my bed. With shaking hands, I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. Slowly, I leaned over the edge of the bed, angling the light beneath. A face stared back at me. Pale, bloated, lips torn and blue. Water dripped from its empty eyes, black pits that locked onto mine. I screamed and scrambled backward, crashing into the wall. The figure crawled out, jerking in unnatural movements, leaving wet trails on my floor. It opened its mouth, but no words came out, only a rush of black water, spilling across the hardwood. I don't remember how I got out of my apartment. I ran barefoot, through the city streets until the sun rose. When I returned home, the door was locked, the floors dry, my phone sitting undisturbed on my nightstand. But I know what I saw. I've been moving from place to place ever since, never staying anywhere too long. But it doesn't matter. Every night, I hear the same sound. Drip, drip, drip. They are waiting for me to return to the lake. And I know that one day I will.